Empress Zarathul of the Vortanian Empire pulled the rough worker's cloak tighter around her luminescent blue skin as she navigated the cramped corridors of Mining Station Omega-7. The disguise was necessary. No one could know that the ruler of 12 star systems was personally investigating reports of impossible human innovations in the Outer Rim territories. For 3 centuries, her empire had dismissed humans as a primitive species, useful only for manual labor in the dangerous mining operations that more advanced races avoided. Yet lately, productivity reports from human-operated stations showed efficiency increases that defied explanation. She turned a corner in the lower maintenance levels and froze. There, hunched over a makeshift workbench in a storage alcove barely large enough for a single person, sat a human. The dim light from a small handheld device, what humans called a flashlight, illuminated weathered technical manuals and scattered mechanical components. The human was young, perhaps in his mid-20s by their species standards, with calloused hands and grease-stained coveralls. Dark hair fell across his forehead as he squinted at the pages, occasionally making notes on scraps of recycled metal with a crude stylus. "Excuse me," Zarathul said softly, modulating her voice to match the local worker dialect she'd studied. "What are you doing?" The human looked up, startled. His name tag read, David Chen. She noted the lack of fear in his eyes. Most species showed immediate deference to Vortanian authority, even disguised. "Oh, sorry. Didn't mean to block the corridor," David said, starting to gather his materials. "Just trying to figure out this power coupling problem. The main generators keep overheating, but the official repair manual doesn't make sense for our specific setup." Zarathul's translator implant struggled with several technical terms the human used. She stepped closer, genuinely curious. "You're studying on your own time?" David smiled, a peculiarly human expression that somehow conveyed warmth despite showing teeth, a threat display in most species. "Yeah, I know it's weird. Most folks here just do their shifts and sleep, but I figure if I can understand how these systems really work, maybe I can make them better." Better? The concept seemed foreign. In Vortanian society, improvement came from above, from the scientifically superior castes. Workers followed instructions. "Sure, like see this?" David pointed to a diagram in his manual. "The thermal regulation. System assumes optimal conditions, but down here we've got fluctuating gravity fields from the asteroid's rotation. So I've been working on modified flow patterns that account for the gravitational variations." Zarathul found herself leaning, in despite herself. The mathematics David was scribbling were sophisticated, not quite at the level of Imperial Academy standards, but the reasoning was sound. More than sound, it was elegant in its simplicity. "Where did you learn this mathematics?" she asked. Carefully. David laughed. "Picked it up from the old manuals mostly. Some stuff from before we got integrated into the Empire. My grandfather was an engineer before the occupation. Before we joined," he corrected quickly. "He taught me to always ask why and what if." The Empress felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: surprise. This human was essentially conducting independent research with primitive tools in a storage closet, achieving results that her Imperial engineers would need advanced laboratories to accomplish. "Show me," she said impulsively. For the next 2 hours, David walked her through his modifications. Using nothing but salvaged parts and his flashlight for illumination, he'd created a thermal regulation system that was 17% more efficient than Imperial standard designs. More shocking still, he'd done it by understanding principles, not just following procedures. "You see?" David explained, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "The Vortanian designs are incredibly advanced, don't get me wrong, but they're built for perfect controlled environments. Down here in the real world, we need something that can adapt." Zarathul realized with growing amazement that this human was teaching her things about her own empire's technology, not just fixing problems, but genuinely improving upon designs that had remained unchanged for centuries. "Why don't you submit these improvements officially?" she asked. David's expression grew cautious. Ma'am, with respect, humans don't submit. Improvement suggestions, that's not how things work for our kind. The simple statement hit Zarathul like a physical blow. Here was innovation happening in a storage closet by flashlight because the system she'd inherited couldn't conceive that a primitive species might have something valuable to contribute. What if things could work differently? She ventured. David studied her face in the dim light. You talk kind of fancy for a maintenance worker. You some kind of supervisor or something? Zarathul made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. She pulled back her hood, letting her natural bioluminescence illuminate the cramped space. David's eyes widened as he recognized the distinctive markings of Vortanian royalty. I am Empress Zarathul, she said simply. And you, David Chen, have just taught me that my empire has been making a fundamental error for 3 centuries. David's flashlight clattered to the floor. I didn't mean any disrespect, Your Majesty. I was just... You were innovating, she interrupted. You were thinking. You were improving things because you believed they could be better. She paused, looking around the tiny space where more genuine scientific advancement had occurred than in her palace laboratories in years. Tell me, David Chen, how would you reorganize an empire if you could make it more efficient? 6 months later, David Chen became the first human appointed to the Imperial Council of Sciences. His adaptive innovation protocol revolutionized Vortanian technology development, establishing research partnerships between theoretical species and practical species across the empire. The mining station's productivity increased by 47% in the first year alone. But more importantly, Empress Zarathul learned that the brightest lights sometimes shine in the darkest places, held by those who refuse to accept that this is just how things are done. The flashlight David had been using that night was preserved in the Imperial Museum with a simple plaque. Sometimes the greatest discoveries are made not in laboratories, but in storage closets by those curious enough to ask, what if? And, in the royal archives in Zarathul's personal journal, a single entry marked the date she met David Chen. Today I learned that wisdom doesn't always flow downward from the throne. Sometimes it shines upward from a flashlight.